Let's talk.
Giles Brown.
Every Monument Will Fall is the new book by Professor Dan Hicks, the curator and professor of contemporary archaeology at Oxford University. It looks how we have a conversation about the past and the present. Here to tell me more about it is the author of Every Monument Will Fall, Professor Dan Hicks. Professor Hicks, good morning to you.
Morning. How are you, Giles?
I'm very well, thank you. I love the title, Every Monument Will Fall, because people are going to think, oh, right, are we talking statues? Should we get rid of the W word immediately? This is going to be a woke reimagination of the British Empire and the British Museum, et cetera, et cetera. So what is the central argument of Every Monument Will Fall?
And so at the heart of it is about what we think of as a monument and how we remember. So really the book is about the cultures of who we remember and who we don't, who gets remembered in institutions like our museums or our universities or in the public space, and whose lives are erased, whose sort of memories are erased. And really at the heart of it is an argument for any society to be able to choose who it remembers and how it remembers, rather than having to just inherit the memories of our ancestors and to always remember the same people and the same thing.
But that's really interesting, because we're coming up to the 18th of May is International Museums Day, isn't it? And this year they're looking at the link between museums and galleries and their communities, because so for too long museums have been seen these dusty places with another suit of armor and something to do with Stephenson's rocket. And my child, I was a schoolboy in the 70s, Professor. I was being dragged around, and the closest you got was an interactive thing, was pushing a thing and pushing a button, and something would light up, in a medieval village.
Yeah.
but galleries and museums should be focal points for understanding and discovery, and not sort of these are the people that we enslaved, we introduced a civilization, or something like that.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And so I think increasingly, as compared with, as you talk about in the 1970s, I had exactly the same experience in the 70s and 80s of, what the museums of that time were all about, which was about things rather than, people. And I think one of the shifts over the past, years has been that actually sort of, we think of our museums and we think overall of our memory sort of institutions, our universities for knowledge, monuments for remembering the publics of the past. We think of them more as sort of public spaces, more as sort of things where we can care about people rather than only trying to hold on to objects. So really that's sort of what the book's about, is about how we get the human sides of those things, but also we look, and we're very sort of open about, telling the histories of the dehumanization that can happen as well.
I mean, there is. Can you draw a line, if you like, between, again, the great Victorian statue building sort of epidemic of the, where you couldn't move for a statue being put up. You had a bandstand in the park, you had a statue of a local dignitary at the time, and then, of course, that will reflect itself in that other great institution, albeit the art gallery or the museum. And then there are the artifacts that are, if you like, displayed almost like a trophy cabinet. So this, we now shun away from people who have sort of tiger heads on the wall, but yet you could argue that the Victorian stroke 20th century museum is very much a case of that, without an understanding of what you might think is, look at that basic artifact, look at that, doesn't that just prove how basic they are? But that is in fact somebody's skull, and therefore we should have more empathy and bring more of an understanding to what's going on.
Yes, exactly. Well, certainly at the very least, we need to sort of know what's in our museum. So that's sort of one of the first arguments of the book, is we need sort of transparency about what's in the British Museum, but what's in sort of so many other museums as well. I don't know if you remember, 2 years ago or so, when it was found out that, against any sort of rational thought that anyone would ever imagine at the British Museum, it was found out that it seemed to have been sort of taking things from itself.
Yeah.
That been stealing.
I'll just take this home with me. Yeah. I remember that. Yeah.
And the reason that was sort of possible, that issue, was that we don't know what's in the British Museum, that there isn't an accurate, catalogue or a database. Now, that goes not only for looted objects or for objects which were, totally illegally sort of taken, it also goes for ancestral remains as well. It goes for sort of bodies of people from the past. So one thing I argue is we need more, we actually need to know, what there is in our museums and who is in our museums, because in some cases, actually, these are important things for and sort of people in terms of the people that are their descendants. And so returning ancestors or returning objects is one part of that. And at the very least, sort of being open, because, of course, it isn't that everything needs to go back. But in some cases, it does.
Yeah, I mean, Benin, isn't it? That was the big one in Nigeria, those artifacts as well, which is incredibly, it was a civilization that we're only sort of starting to rediscover. And again, it is that attitude of the we can look after that, and but if we send it back to Nigeria, it'll just disappear because they're corrupt and they don't know what they're doing with it and they won't treat it in the same way, which is a terrible thing to say. But that's the sort of underlying, isn't it, the attitude.
Exactly. I mean, that has been the attitude. And certainly in my last book, where I looked at the Benin bronzes, I mean, I uncovered how actually the looting and the taking of things and the, knocking of things down and the selling of things on the open market was actually what the soldiers and the sailors and the administrators involved in that expedition had done in 1897 and in the years afterwards. So all those arguments over, sort of saving culture were rather upside down. For this book, I'm really, trying to learn from the movements that we encounter in the museums and the universities at the moment. On the one side, the fallism movement, this sort of long, right from the 60s and the 70s, there have been arguments for the removal of sort of monuments to empire. Mm-hmm. And so fallism, and then obviously the returning of objects, and also this idea of the decolonization of the knowledge in our institutions. Now, I'm not involved in those sort of campaigns, but I work in an institution that has been, where they've been directed. So I want to learn about the history of, well, actually, what are they responding sort of to? As you've implied already, there was a period in the later part of the 19th century and the early part of the last century when our cultural institutions and our universities and artworks were, put to work in order to tell narratives and to create forms of sort of memory that aren't sort of necessarily how we would want to do things in the present. And so it's really being open about that and understanding actually, how our museums sort of, came to sort of hold the bodies of other people's ancestors and how they came to hold sort of looted objects and actually, what we do with them in the present and what we do with the memory cultures and the monumentalities in the present.
And also it's an interesting thing is because you will get the reply that, oh yeah, but the thing is history is only written by the victors, which is actually written by those that actually write stuff, because you've got to look, no, because unless you are a people of the steep and therefore can't physically carry your stuff with you, then a lot of people write stuff down, but we haven't bothered to look for it really. And it's only now that we're doing the archaeology to look for the stuff from the people who have been defeated. Because before you've been vanquished, game over, null and void, and therefore we're not going to bother. So we will write that. But actually, you will look and you will find, you would look and find contemporary writings, but not in a way that a Western explorer would understand 200 years ago.
Yes, absolutely. And so a part of the value of these objects in our museums is for actually understanding how they got there. So on the one side, it's about understanding the cultures from which they came, although often, though, it's the people who live in those cultures at the present that sort of want to be, doing that work in order to understand, their own histories. So a part of the role of a curator in a modern museum of sort of world culture, of archaeology, of anthropology, really relates to understanding actually what the public are asking us. How did these objects sort of get here? And is there, someone somewhere asking for them back? Yeah. So I think, that's important because our museums, we've sort of never needed something like a world culture museum more in the present, because these are spaces where we can look at art and culture and ways of sort of thinking, outside of a Eurocentric lens. But that, doesn't mean that we have to retain all of the old narratives about barbarism versus civilization, all those sort of things. that we inherit from the past. So really, Every Monument Will Fall is a book about how we inherit those pasts from empire, how we see the value in, the institutions, but also how we can see change. Because we are told sometimes that these institutions must never change. We are told sometimes that a monument must never be removed. And I think that's just impossible. We can't have a memory culture. We can't have sort of museums where they're sort of preserved in aspic forever. That isn't going to work. And I can't imagine any other sector of our society where that would be told that it can never change. Imagine if that was healthcare. Imagine if that was the criminal justice system. If there were things that were out of step with our times and we were told, actually, no, ultimately, that's sort of how we've always done it. And so it can't change. But that's what we're living with in the world of art and culture and heritage at the moment. So that's a part of what the book is doing, is to say we need to manage the change in the historic built environment in our museums, in our knowledge institutions.
But the thing with Professor Hicks, and with, and I'm not putting, but museums and galleries are run by academics in the main. They're not in the same sort of in the same pressure as the NHS or whatever. And present company notwithstanding, an awful lot of academics are very conservative with a small c by their very nature. It has always been done without, if you've been to certain libraries, if you went to certain schools as I did, things hadn't changed, in the library that I was at school with for 100 years, and it was bleeding well going to stay that way, Brown, So basically, they attract the sort of person that likes to catalogue things and keep it that way because it's never had to change, and that's the way we do things around here.
Yeah, exactly. And so that certainly is sort of what a museum had turned into in the later 19th century, early 20th century. I don't think it's actually what museums always were. There were earlier models of museums. And actually something like a museum, that act of assembling objects, that act of, making monuments to remember sort of things, is something that all societies do in different ways. So there are different sorts of museums. There are different sorts of monumentalities, which we can sort of learn from. And actually, of course, what counts as the monumental, what counts as a museum is always evolving in any society. So we need to have a time when some are seeking to weaponize culture again in terms of saying, there's a culture war, as we're told. There's this, as you mentioned, this word woke, in order to say, actually, nothing should ever change. Actually, what I'm interested in is the fact that sort of what they call the culture war has a history. There's a history of the weaponization of culture. There's the history of the taking of objects with violence and the putting of monuments up in order to celebrate war. So what Every Monument Will Fall sort of does is it says, and it isn't called All the Monuments Must Fall. Yeah. It's called Every Monument Will Fall, because actually we're going to hold on to whatever monuments we wish to as a society and allow others actually, not to continue. And that's what any society does all the time. The world is constantly changing outside, in the landscape. I mean, look out the window. The world is continually changing. We're not holding on to things exactly the same. So the idea that we're told that every last, garden gnome is something that has to never be removed, and there has to be a little sign up that says, here's what the meaning of this gnome was in the 1970s, and here's what it is in the present. That's the point we got to a couple of years ago when I began writing this book in the UK and elsewhere in the world, that we were told that nothing must ever change. Obviously that isn't sort of tenable. So I'm just sort of trying to set in the book, really, to look at these issues in a sensible way and to tell the histories and not to be afraid of those histories, which actually some people really, they don't want to hear these histories.
Yeah, but the thing is in history, and, I quite like my history. You can probably tell by the way I'm bouncing coming down on my chair at the moment. But the thing with history is that it's wonderful because we are having the discussions. Again, like libraries, people think that history and libraries are dusty, boring places where nothing ever happens. But how fascinating to find this new information and to go and have a reappraisal from both sides. So you get the entire, it's not black and white, it's technicolor. And by returning artifacts to where they came from, we may discover something new about them or learn more and enrich our understanding above the world that we lived in and are currently living in.
Yes, absolutely. But sometimes as well, actually, you can remember the past, you can learn about the past through altering the built environment. So one example would be the Cecil Rhodes monument in Oxford outside Oriel College, and that's one of the examples that I talk about in the book, where there was a decision by the governing body to remove what some have understood as a monument to the origins of apartheid and to leave the gap or to replace it with someone else, or just to allow the culture of sort of memory to shift. And so they made that decision. And then because they were lent on by who knows who from government or whatever, that monument hasn't yet been removed, and it isn't about sort of imminently to. So what was interesting for me was actually that idea that it seems that a college or an institution sometimes isn't able to make a basic change that it wants to in terms of who it remembers and how, not least when a monument is actually sort of hurtful to some people in the wider community, some members of its own community. So that's interesting. That's a sense of actually any of us who make a decision in order to change things ought to be able, a bit like listed building consent. Buildings are sort of changed and altered all the time in the same way as the museum will constantly, change its sort of displays and update its labels. Again, imagine a science museum where you couldn't update a label or update an object or what's sort of there, sort of based on the evolution of sort of scientific knowledge. Imagine if we all had to present sort of physics or, natural history based on 19th century ideas rather than what we understand now. So culture has to work the same, I think, in certain ways. Yeah,
absolutely. I'm just thinking about because obviously in Spain we have had to go through this because obviously we had the Pact of Forgetting after the Civil War, and now in the past 20 years we've seen the taking down of some pretty right, to put it mildly, right wing symbols and statues and street names, etc. And it's worked, but there are rumblings from political parties who will leap on this to go, it's just a thing, and because we are at that long period of time where it seems there are very few people who are actually still around who were around when we were in the 40s when Spain was going through Franco. So therefore, it's very easy for those who are a little less informed, a little more populist, to leap on and go. You see, they're tearing down statues. They'll be putting up somebody we never heard of next, and that's just citing on. And here comes the W word again. You know what I mean, Professor?
Yes, exactly. And of course, that's entirely natural, after what, because the reason that these images were erected in the first place and the reason that objects were put in museums, which, took a lot of hard work. I mean, this isn't an easy thing to do, to go and loot all these countries and put objects in museums in London or, Madrid or wherever. And indeed, to erect all these images of the colonizers or of the supposed histories or sort of heroes of history. That takes work, and it's an understanding that emerged in the later 19th century. It evolved into fascism, but it was there in imperialism as well, that art and culture really matter. Now, we in the present, of course, also think art and culture really matters, but that doesn't mean that we have to hold on to one genre of art. I mean, look what's sort of happening in the US at the moment. You've got sort of Trump removing the funding for the National Endowment of the humanities, and using that money in order to erect a series of images in a garden of these figures of American heroes. So that's a choice about how to hardwire memory into the built environment. And it's something that has a history, but we have to allow these things to, change over time, these sort of cultures of memory. And I think in Spain, in the UK, elsewhere in the world, we need something more like what the Germans have got, where they talk about, memory culture, and they talk about not just history, but also memory. How do we remember as a society? Who do we remember? How do we make the choices about who and how we remember? So I work in these fields. I talk about the 4 A's that I work in. And so I work across archaeology, anthropology, art and architecture. And in between those 4 fields, you've got all these sort of ways in which things and sort of people come together in order to work out who we are and where we're going and where we came from. And it's a privilege to work in those disciplines. But they're also things that have sort of public spaces as well. Our museums, art outside and architecture, that's a part of our memory culture as well. So in a series of examples, and I run in the book from the American Civil War to the Crimean War, to Ireland in the 1860s. And there's a lot of London, actually. There's a lot of walking around Hyde Park and all of the monumental landscape of Hyde Park as well. So I just look in these different sort of instances of sort of forms of memory, but also at the heart of the book, there's a history of those people that are not, memorialized in stone or, bronze as figures, but whose ancestral human remains, their actual bodies were abused sort of posthumously. And there's one example at the heart of the book, which I'm sure you might have sort of read about online, and The Guardian reported on it sort of 2 weeks ago. It's been all over the media since then, about the use of a human skull at an Oxford sort of college table, at a dessert table.
Yeah.
From the 1940s up until as recently as 2015. So I sort of try in the book to tell the history of who that person was, who the woman was, whose sort of head was abused in that way, and to hold her memory. And of course, we don't know her name, but the fact that this unnamed person was abused in that way for all that amount of time, hold her life and history up against the Cecil Rhodeses and the Edward Colstons and the Pitt Riverses, where I work in a museum named after Augustus Pitt Rivers, and so on. And really ask the question: who are we choosing to remember? Who are we choosing to erase from history, and even physically abuse their bodies? But of course, add on to that then the hundreds of thousands, who knows how many of those ancestral remains are just sort of sitting in the boxes of the museums up and down the UK, across Europe. How far are your listeners right this moment from a warehouse full of ancestral remains, from a museum, from who knows where in the world, and there's actually a lot more of this out there, and we don't know what's in those museums. So it's about open secrets. It's about being open about these histories and sort of trying to find some degree of dignity or humanity for the people whose sort of pasts we're inheriting in these institutions.
The book is called Every Monument Will Fall, a story of remembering and forgetting. It's by Professor Dan Hicks, who is speaking today. Professor, if people want to find you online, I know you're on the Instagram because I just started following you. So
that's right. Yeah, we followed each other back.
Exactly. So where's the best place for people to find you and find out what you are up to and continue the conversation? Absolutely.
And so the book is with a penguin, and so if you simply Google Every Monument Will Fall,
it's on our own virtual bookstore as well. They have to click on the front page on our bookstore and they go directly to that.
Oh, that's amazing. Okay, fantastic. And then on the socials, Dan Hicks. You can find me on Instagram, Blue Sky, LinkedIn. Everywhere except X, really. I gave up on X, last year because it just, for the sort of work I do, it just got so, silly and so toxic. I can
just imagine your inbox must have been groaning with reasoned
so
arguments.
I waved goodbye to the 40,000 followers there, the 50,000, but actually, many more real people rather than bots are interacting with me now. So it's the Instagram and the Blue Sky mainly. You can find me on Facebook, but mainly also I should say I not only wrote this, what's actually a fairly long book and the longest book I've ever written, but I also read the whole thing out for the audio book. So I did the audio book.
Perfect. Yeah.
So if you've enjoyed hearing this, any of your listeners, you can download Every Monument Will Fall from wherever you get your audio books. And I've got to say, there's nothing like being forced to read out your own book to realise what you like and what you don't about how you write. But no, I was really pleased with it in the end. It took me 7 days to do the reading, but I got there in the end, and it was really exciting.
The book is called Every Monument Will Fall. It's by Professor Dan Hicks. Dan, thank you so much for your time today.
Really, it was fun. Thanks so much. Good to talk to you.